I think it's important that before we dive deeply into some of the finer details of working with 3D inside Photoshop, that we take kind of a generic high-level view of something, just to give you a sense of how a 3D project is held together. So to follow along with this, I want you to go to Working Files, open up the Photoshop Projects folder, and then double-click on Jupiter. That opens up this project that I made here more or less from scratch. There are two images here from NASA, but all this stuff I just built using the 3D tools here inside Photoshop. Press Controller Command 0 to kind of zoom in a little bit on that. There we go. Now what we have here is a 3D layer and a 2D layer. The 3D layer is Jupiter with the rings going around it. So you have two things inside one layer. And then the 2D layer is the star field behind it there. The star field is just a smart object layer, and you can spot that by that icon down there. And Jupiter's 3D, you could spot that by that box there telling you that you get a 3D layer here. Now when I click on the 3D layer, you see these little things showing up inside the 3D panel, and these things all relate to the properties over here on the right-hand side. To kind of get a better sense of how this works, though, I want to click on the Move tool. Notice that when the Move tool is not selected, you don't see all those things floating around the outside here, like a ground plane and a secondary view. But you click on this, and they all show up. And that's what switches on to 3D activity, because here you're manipulating this thing in 3D space. But when you're not working in 3D space, when you're working down here on something else, this thing behaves like a 2D layer, like a typical Photoshop layer. You can do all sorts of things to a layer like this that you would do with any standard 2D layer inside Photoshop. For example, we can add an adjustment layer here. So go down here and add an adjustment layer, let's say level. Clip it to Jupiter by holding down the Alt or the Option key and clip it together so it affects just the Jupiter layer. I can make it brighter, darker, what have you. And so it works just like a typical Photoshop layer. I'll go to History and undo that. Okay, so now I'll click on the Move tool and everything switches on because the 3D things really happen only when you move stuff around. So the Move tool is now selected. All right, let's take a look at the 3D panel again here, clicking on that. And these are the elements here inside this 3D object. Let's start off with the thing at the bottom, that's the light. Lights are added by default. You don't have to have a light. This one's called an infinite light. There are a couple other kinds of lights. I'll talk about those guys in upcoming lessons. I'll click on that just to make it active. When you do that, its properties show up here in the Properties panel in terms of how bright it is and the softness of the shadow. And since this is space, the shadow should be pretty sharp since it's in a vacuum, but you could adjust that if you want to, and change the color of the light if you want to. You can't see the light, but I'll close this down, and then there's the source of the light there, and here's the controller for it right there. Let's go back to the 3D panel here and go up a notch here to Jupiter and rings. There are two elements inside this 3D object. I'll open them both up here. Jupiter is just a sphere. So I created the sphere here using the tools that you can use to create a simple object, a mesh as it's called here inside Photoshop. And then I applied what's called a diffuse texture to it, or a diffuse map. If I click on Sphere Material, then its properties show up here inside this Properties panel called Materials. And there's diffuse up here at the top. Diffuse really describes how something is going to look. In this case, it's a file. And the file is something that I got from NASA. You can tell that a file's been applied to it because a little icon shows up there inside the folder. Notice that most of these guys don't have those icons except for bump. Otherwise, they just use colors, typically gray. But here there's a file associated with this. So I go here and go Edit Texture. And they get a little message here, but that's okay. I'll click OK. And there is the file that I use to wrap around that sphere. And when you use a file like this, frequently there's a seam. They're pretty careful at NASA to try not to have a seam, but it goes from here and then wraps around the other side. But if you want to see the seam, you go to Filter, go to Other, and go to Offset. And then you can see the seam showing up right there. But on the sphere itself, you'll hardly notice that there's a seam. And even if there is a seam here, you can pretty much get rid of it using Content Aware Fill, and I'll show you how to do that in an upcoming lesson. So I'll cancel out of this, and I'll close down this little look at the texture. That's how this sphere turned from something that's just gray to this little thing that looks really like Jupiter. There are other materials characteristics here as well, which we're going to discuss in detail in upcoming lessons, but this is where you access the materials. The one that has the other file right there is Bump. And Bump is something that gives it some topography. I'm going to zoom in a bit on it by going Control Command Plus a couple times and getting in there. There we go. Now I'm going to take Bump to 0, and you'll see how it gets kind of smooth looking. And this stuff that shows up down here, that's because we haven't rendered in a while. As you're working in 3D, sometimes things get kind of ugly looking like this, and what you need to do is click on the Render button right down there at the bottom of the Properties panel. What's going to happen is that it'll sort of render here as you work, and it's going to look kind of messy right now, kind of noisy, but it'll have 2 or 3 passes going by, and that noise will more or less go away. And you just let it render a few times, make a few passes, and when it looks good enough, you can just stop by just clicking anywhere and it stops rendering. So there you go, those things are now gone, and we're back to looking at this thing, and it's all smooth now. But as I roll to the right here, you see that it gets a little topography. And I'm using the exact same file from NASA that I used up here down here, what happens is that Photoshop takes that file and turns it into something black and white. So black areas go in and white areas come out. It gives you that sort of extra feel for topography there. That's a little too much, I think. I'll pull it back a bit like that. These other guys control how this thing looks as well, but those are the two main things, bump and diffuse. The next thing up, that's rings. Clicking on this, the rings are extruded. If I clicked on your star field for a second and click on 3D, and you'll see that you can extrude something from any object or from any flat plane. And so what I did, I made this circle like that and extruded it. But the extrusion is very thin. I'm going to go back over here and click on Jupiter. The extrusion is only 2 pixels. It's a very thin extrusion. So if I take a look at this thing by rotating around a bit here on the x-axis like that, see how thin it is. And it got its color here, but it's a gradient, very straightforward. So I click on, let's say, the front inflation. That means the part that was lifted up in the extrusion. If I click on that, you'll see that it has a diffuse as well, and you can tell it's got a file by the little icon there. I click on this, take a look at the texture, and there it is, just a gradient applied to that ellipse. So I'll close this down again. So that's how we got the colors there. I'm not sure they're realistic. In fact, I'm sure they're not realistic, but I just want to make it kind of colorful. You notice here under opacity, we have a file, whereas we don't have one for bump. And the reason for the opacity file is that I wanted to make some holes there in the rings to make it look realistic. You can see the stars showing through there. I'll show you how that one looks. The opacity file defines opacity. If I open it up, you'll see that there's black and white. White is opaque, black is transparent, and gray is something in between. And that's what the opacity map does in this particular case. Close that down there. So that's basically the approach that you take. Every 3D object has some number of elements inside there that have all these materials applied to them that give them their appearance. Now above there's current view. Current view is the camera control. When you're working on these guys down here, you can control the object itself. You're just working with the object, not with the view as far as the camera is concerned. I'll click on history and start all over again here so we get back to the first place we started. Back here, if you want to go to current view controls the camera. That controls everything all at once, like that. We're not going to work in scene in this course all that much, but I will point it out. It basically gives you options to take a look at it as you work on it to give you some different ways of examining how your 3D object is behaving. It's just not something that would really appropriate for this course. It's kind of higher level, so we're going to take a pass on the scene set of properties. We will go to environment, though. Environment basically describes what's around the outside of a 3D object in terms of how this thing relates to the environment. Frequently, you'll put a 3D object in a location, and you want that 3D object to take on the color and lighting of that location, so you use the environment properties to do that. So you have something called an image-based light here that gives it a light based on the image that you can put around the outside of it. Kind of like putting something inside a giant globe and have the globe sort of shining down on that 3D object. And you can control the lighting here. You can also control a file if you want to put an image file as that image-based light. You can also have what's called an environment map, which behaves differently than an image-based light. The environment map just basically adds the color of the environment to the 3D object to whatever degree you want to apply it. And finally, you can control the ground plane here in terms of how the shadows and lights work on top of the ground plane down there. You can have reflections or just shadows or both. Okay, so that's just a basic overview of how 3D projects work. All these various characteristics that you can touch on when you create a 3D project. We're going to dive into them in much greater detail as we move through the course.